Well, welcome to the most important panel of the afternoon, breaking down data silos, data sharing, and data standardization. I'm privileged to be joined by some extraordinary thought leaders from the industry. Let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Alice Reid. I'm head of Google Cloud UK's public sector, transport, infrastructure, defense, national security, health and research. It still doesn't trip off the tongue. And we have together about 75 minutes of some thought-provoking questions, debate, and equally importantly, we've got a good section of about 20 minutes of questions from you. I've been strictly told we want questions, not observations, so please do use the first 45 minutes or so to really challenge this extremely high-profile set of panelists with your best questions. With no further ado, I'm going to look to my right. Hayden, take it away. A little bit about you and your profile in the industry, please.
Thank you, Alice. Okay, I'll try not to shout with these mics on, because usually you want to try and project, and you end up sort of deafening people as you do it. So, hello, everybody. My name's Hayden Sutherland. I run a consultancy called Ideal Interface. I'm based just outside Glasgow in Scotland, even though I sound like I'm from South London. That's because I am, but I live in Glasgow and have done for the last 12 years. So I moved my consultancy up there. My team work remote, and we consult on some rather large technology, digital projects and client engagements. So the stuff we do, I'm usually an architect. What does that mean from a technology perspective? For those who know me, I know I just draw boxes and arrows and point at them and then get really frustrated when people don't know when I point at them what I'm talking about. And then that's good. But I've worked on some rather large technology projects. I was the architect for the UK's rail data marketplace, based on Google. There we go, a bit of a plug there. And,
very good, keep going.
And alongside one of my fellow sort of members on the team up here, I'm on the steering board of Metis Scotland. For those who don't know, it's the Mobility as a Service. It's the umbrella organisation for them. And for the last few years, for about the last 5 years, I have been running something called the Open Transport Initiative. The Open Transport Initiative was trying to help enable, basically we called it the open banking for data, for transport, way before anybody used other terms like smart data and those sorts of things from the UK government. So for the last 5 years, we've been talking about how you must make customer data and accounts shared, interoperable, securely shared, and how those silos have got to go. And I realised that rhymed and I shouldn't say that. So Alice, is that enough for you, or do you want, is that okay?
I think that's a very good opening. Thank you, Hayden. I'm going to pass the mic to you, Anna.
So, hi everyone, I'm Anna. For those that don't know me, I'm CEO at Arcadis Technologies. We're a software scale-up that builds AI for transport operators. Primarily, we work with local authorities, tier 1 contractors, consultants who are trying to make head and tail of data that's out there to make more evidence-based decisions on how they might plan, design, build, or operate their systems. So to give that, maybe a couple of examples, brief. For example, working with a local authority, trying to understand buses and bus pinch points from the perspective of the infrastructure, really using data and evidence to then say, how should we be prioritizing our investment, or how do we make the winning business case to bid for funding for how we can go out and build a better system based on data. Likewise, working with a highways agency like Connect Plus Services on the M25, working to optimize roadworks. How can you look at predicted data on flow rates to do roadworks at the right time of day? So very data-driven ways of building decision-making into workflows on how we operate. And I think one of the core tenets that we think about at Alkira, and why this panel, I'm really excited for the discussion and debate that's gonna come, is around that concept of data silos, data standardization, and just how important data is for how our decision-making systems need to operate. As humans, we exist in a world, we have that feedback loop to learn. You see something that happens, you fall over, you try again. In the transport sector, I think often things can be done based on gut instinct and maybe kind of one survey once a year, but actually there's a real opportunity to try and make data really part of that decision-making workflow. And there's huge opportunities from our perspective as an organization in AI, how not just machine learning, but actually some of these more modern techniques that are coming out around LLMs or maybe agentic AI will start to really shift the paradigm around how we can use data for our decision making. But at the foundation of all of that is understanding, prioritizing, and valuing how we use data. And maybe I can then hand over to Katherine from the DFT's perspective on what DFT are thinking about around how to make that foundation very strong for the UK.
Oh, thank you. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Katherine Williamson. I'm the Chief Data Officer in the Department for Transport. So I kind of wear a multitude of hats. Internally facing, I support the business, the DFT, in terms of what they're going to do with their own data, break down their own data silos, how we're going to use data for business purposes like HR, all the way through to policy purposes. But the thing you're probably most interested in is the fact that we have a remit facing outwards into the sector. So my team published the Transport Data Strategy in 2023, looking at kind of the key themes, the key barriers, the key challenges to data in the transport sector. And actually, a lot of that still very relevant today. A lot of that document is still very valid. But where we are now is actually the technology is in a very different place. There are things we can do now we couldn't do in 2023. So thinking about how do we make data available to support that, and actually thinking about where we are politically, which again is in a different place to where we were in 2023, and starting to think about the role transport plays in bigger initiatives for government. So we've heard a lot from Andy Burnham and the other mayors this morning about the growth agenda and the critical role that transport plays in that. But actually, the other things that transport can do to help society at large. So health is a really big one with active travel, the role it has to interact with the energy sector, starting to think about all those things. And so my team now are working on a data action plan and trying to think about what the next stage is on from the data strategy. What do we need to do to support the sector? What the role is for DFT? And so I'm really interested in this discussion today and helping shape that thinking. Hand to Miranda.
Thank you very much. Hello, lovely to see so many people here. I'm Miranda Sharp. I work for myself. My company's called Metis Digital. My classics mad child, I asked them for a relatively positive female role model from Greek mythology. I got one that didn't eat all her children, so I'm very grateful for that. My passion since I worked at Royal Mail and an Ordnance Survey has been the value of data. How do we generate a fair exchange of value when we are working with data? I've also worked at the ODI, where I also got to work on the value to the economy of sharing data. In my spare time, I chair the Data and Digital Working Group for the Infrastructure Client Group. I'm a trustee on the Centre for Cities, which is it was really interesting to hear the mayors talk this morning about transport and high-density housing and how those are levers for economic growth. My favourite job at the moment is I'm seconded to the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, working on value of data policy.
Thank you, Miranda. Last but by no means least, Graeme.
Right, thank you. Good afternoon, all. I like Hayden. I'm from Glasgow and Sound Glaswegian. So hopefully I'll speak a bit slower than I normally would. Hopefully no language problems. I am Director of Arcadis and lead in the UK and Ireland our newly formed Intelligent Mobility Services Group, which covers, as the name suggests, everything around intelligent mobility, which brings together data, technology, transport solutions, etc. I'm sure when we've got the strategy completed, which is something I need to go and work on and finalise over the next few days, you'll hear more about it. I've been involved in the industry. Frighteningly, I was talking to a colleague about it last night, because I usually say about 20 or so years. It was 96, which is coming up in 30, which is pretty frightening. And I know I don't look that old, hopefully you think that. But this isn't the first time that we've had these kind of discussions. And it's something that happens it goes through cycles every few years. There's another directive, there's another plan. And invariably, there's a lot of the same ideas are there, and they never get fully executed. And I think it's part of the challenge and problem that there's lots of data out there. There's lots of opportunities and potential uses for it. And one of the strands, I think, hopefully in the discussions that we'll have, is going to try and play, maybe not quite devil's advocate, but perhaps from an operational perspective, because I'm involved in a lot of delivery and operational contracts. And even from my own perspective, I'm spending a lot of time travelling around UK, Europe, and further afield. And looking at it, what do the operators or clients, the customers want, but equally, what do the consumers want as well? And more often than not, because we can, we think we should, But just because we can doesn't mean we should. We should be looking at what users want. What do we need to keep things moving? What do customers want? Keep it simple and don't overcomplicate things. And I think when we talk about breaking down the silos, I think that's one of the key imperatives for me. I think just as you were saying there about, unfortunately missed the mayor's session this morning, but it's similar from over a number of years, been involved in some of the smart cities areas. It's recognising that transport shouldn't necessarily stand alone. There's a lot of benefit in integrating transport data with other data. You get much more value from it. You start to develop the use and business cases behind what data is needed to drive solid positive outcomes, and that should be behind a lot of our decision making. And lastly, just from our personal side, and a pitch for it, as Hayden said, we're both on the steering board of Mass Scotland. And over the last, probably best part, late last year through to now, we've been working on the development of a roadmap towards the future, potentially for Mass in Scotland, and that was published last week. And we naturally think it's a pretty good read. It makes a lot of asks in terms of some of the ideas that should be coming from government, as well as some of the other elements to try and make Mass happen. So that's available. If you don't read it now, wait until after this session's finished, but I'd recommend having a read at that. And some of the items I think we'll be covering here will be kind of picked up in that roadmap as well.
Thank you, Graeme, and thank you, panellists. I'm sure you'll all agree that, my goodness, their credibility and heritage in developing where we need to get to from an integrated transport strategy is very much underscored here. So I want us now to double-click on the vision and the strategy. I've got it underscored here how we're going to run in terms of the running order, and it is going to start with you, Katherine. I think for obvious reasons in terms of the strategy that has been developed at Department of Transport in 2023 and still stands, as you say, so relevant now. So why don't we bring to life where we think this transport strategy is going, led by Department of Transport.
So as I said, I think everything in that document is still very much the case. The barriers identified, the key themes identified are very true. But I think where we are now is we're starting to see some real tangible examples of where those barriers are being overcome. And actually, it's those use cases, it's those examples that help get us away from we've been here before, we've had these conversations for a long time. So, we couldn't be in Manchester without talking about the B network and everything that's achieved and everything it's looking to achieve. But, data has been behind a lot of that. The sharing of the data, the linking of the data sets together gives a real tangible example of where it can be done. I think from my perspective within the Department for Transport, it's about understanding where things have worked and where we can use that to support others to do the same, but accepting that actually an area like Manchester, a bit like many years ago, everyone said, well, you can't look at London, it's an outlier. How do we make sure every area gets that support? My team will be familiar with what we've now termed the Rutland problem. No disrespect to Rutland, but how do you come up with a solution? How do you make things work for small local authorities that can't necessarily bring together the economies of scale that you're seeing with the mayoral combined authorities? So for me, it's accepting that those barriers still exist, but actually how do we come together with those use cases to solve them? And I think that coming together, that collaboration, we're starting to see far more of that with mission-based government, with the idea that actually it's come together and solve a problem. It's not just a case of A has this and B wants it for that. It's actually bringing it together with those real tangible benefits. And that's where we're starting to see some level of change.
And that mission-based government obviously is very much predicated on Labour's new vision and way of operating. Can you share an example of what you've seen over the last, how long has it been now? 7 months since the new administration has been in place that has positively benefited the new way of transport through data?
Yep, so I'll give an example of something I was very close to throughout my first part of my career in Department of Transport, which is road safety, and the challenge that we always had of knowing that these horrific collisions occurred, but actually not knowing what happened to these people once they joined the health system. Because actually there was no way to get those two things to talk. And actually we have seen, in the last few months actually a willingness on both sides for people to come together under that health mission banner, and actually for health, for other organisations to come together, get around the table and go, okay, well, we can't open up everything, but what can we do? Where can we start to link these data sets together? Where can we start to improve that understanding? And that was just a space we struggled to go into. And now actually those barriers are starting to be broken down. There is a reason to get people round the table and starting to talk about what's being done. And a lot of it is around the discoverability, uncovering that actually there are pockets of things that are being done, perhaps at small scale, perhaps in terms of academic projects, but bringing that to bear and thinking, well, how can we use that for the system as a whole?
And conversely, final question in this area, in the last 7 months or so, where do you think the greatest opportunities that have been missed lie?
Oh, in terms of things that are missed, I think there is something around the data ownership model where people feel very, Amanda's going to laugh, but it makes people feel very protective. People want to protect their data, and actually with the advent of AI, with more discussion around privacy, security, ethics, all these really, really important things, it has made some people want to grip and hold on to their data more because they feel they've got a responsibility to own and protect it, and they have, but that doesn't mean that can't be shared. And I think there is something around accepting that actually what is your role when you own or are responsible for a data set in terms of making it available in that safe, secure way for the right purpose, and not just going, oh my God, there is a lot of stuff that could be dangerous and misusive. Let me just grip that and own it. And so I think there is definitely something we've missed around resetting the language and resetting the expectations.
Okay. And part of that, of course, is cultural change.
Yeah, very much so.
But most importantly, people realising that transparency of data is a good thing and can be done in a safe and responsible way.
Yeah.
Okay, the next person here that is supposed to answer is you, Hayden.
Oh dear. Well, I applauded the transport data strategy when it came out 2-3 years ago, and it was a real landmark step forward. There were lots of promises and lots of challenges in there that you're trying to tackle head first, and we applaud those as well. I'd like to see that developed. Some areas where I think you talked about, Alice, you talked about the opportunities.
I did.
See, I was paying attention. And I think, this government is all about growth. And if we are going to enable growth or fuel growth in the transport sector, actually across all sectors, data is an enabler of that. I sit and work with people on the Smart Data Council and some various organisations who talk about the multi-billion-pound opportunity we've got from the use of data in the right way. And so if we're to, yes, I'm all around health outcomes and equality outcomes, but also we have to look at using data for growth and building it. You have to look at in other sectors. Graeme mentioned earlier about we have to think cross-sector. Data doesn't think about sectors. Data about a road is not a transport data. It's a smart cities data. It's a healthcare data because the ambulances drive over it. It's a civil matter because it's all these sorts of things. So it's route planning for somebody else. So data doesn't care about silos. So right, but it's the opportunity for growth is a huge one, and cross sector. So we have to think about how we talk about data in our sector, but we also have to align it to how other sectors talk about it as well. It's no good us talking about data in our transport silo if it means nothing to those in other silos. Electric vehicles, we cross over into energy. We use entirely different terminology. So what I'm going to say is, if I leave you with one piece of thing, go away and have a look at something by the Open Data Institute called the data spectrum. It's a key diagram that's used to define data from one end, open data, all the way through to closed data in the middle, with shared interoperable data in the middle. And that data spectrum, take a look at it, and yes, Mass Scotland has actually produced a transport data spectrum just for our sector, and it can be used. You can see, you can almost pin the tail on the donkey of where the different data sits, but it aligns how we talk about data to those used by smart cities, those used by healthcare, those used by the finance sector. Yeah, so we're aligning ourselves with that sharing data across sector, because if we're going to get growth, and it's back to that point about what do I think's missing, we're going to do that. We're going to have to work with other sectors, we're going to have to work cross-sector with data, and then fuel it.
And where do you think that cross-sector working is more advanced, that could act as the poster child for the end state of true data sharing across segments?
The transport sector is way behind. There are other sectors who are sharing data amongst themselves and with other sectors way ahead of us. Open banking and the sectors that were enabled by those is leading into open finance, open energy, open healthcare, and we are somewhere trailing behind with the way that we share data in literally across the sector. We don't even put into procurement of huge, massive transport infrastructure projects and transport digital projects the ability to share data. It's a GDPR requirement to put it in, but we somehow forget to put it in our requirements when we procure new services. So that's the challenge we've got. We've really got to be able to take that forward and start to say, bake it in, think about data, and take it forward like that.
And it, very much makes me think of listening to Devin from National Highways a little early this morning when he said that we need to have a change in mindset about how we think about data.
Yes.
And I think you've just underscored that. Next on my list here is Anna.
Can you ask the exam question again? Or I'm just
Well,
play
the
some
exam
reflections back.
questions are just talk about the vision, where you see from your organisational standpoint, where the transport strategy enriched through data is going, and then what do you think some of the opportunity cost / lost is currently within the industry and segments?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to take that and spin it with what I think we've already heard to try and kind of...
Of course.
Before. So I suppose, and reflecting on some of the discussions that we've heard earlier today as well. So obviously I come from a very biased position of being a solution provider in this space who cares about there being data available to help us move forward. But it's because I truly believe, and have seen the evidence from the projects we've been able to go out and deliver, that use of that data does drive better outcomes. And those better outcomes, to make them more tangible, are around, for local authorities, doing more for less. For example, being able to prioritize 3 schemes that are going to measurably have more impact than one which won't, because of the gut instinct decision versus data-driven decision of how you choose to prioritize those things. So when you start to look into the data, you uncover more sensible outcomes that can be optimized for cost or for safety or for customer experience. And ultimately, that's what policies are going out to set. They're setting kind of those measurable things. And speaking earlier today with some colleagues who work in the public sector, and I will rotate on the public sector quite heavily today, are around kind of this evolution where local transport plans used to exist with, well, they still exist, statutory requirement, local transport plan has to happen, but the requirement to report against key indicators kind of dissolved into the mist at some point in the previous government. But that lack of, I suppose, creating the shining light, that measuring what you're doing, getting the data and evidence base to have an understanding of how you're tracking, is a huge loss for us to be able to, as a sector, drive forward how we operate. So when we talk about data and the silos that exist, it's not, it can be quite abstract, but when I think about data from my perspective, it's around flow rates, it might be about locations of buses, it might be around occupancy, it might be around deprivation from a census to have an understanding of something going on there. It might be around mobile network signal to cross-reference with NAPTAN locations of bus stops to see whether someone's going to be able to check if the bus is late or not. And a lot of this data is owned in very various places. But I think where the challenge lies today actually isn't in the price point of making that data accessible. Neither is in the technology of harvesting that data and making it shareable. The challenge is in the shape of the ecosystem that we've ended up building in the transport space. And I think I've heard a lot of discussions about it, this kind of chicken and egg situation where we want an integrated transport strategy, but we don't have an integrated way of delivering transport. So we kind of back and forth saying, maybe a bit of it's not my problem, and maybe a bit of we don't know how to tie it up. But the nature of how the sector is set up, the nature of the shape of this ecosystem means that you've got kind of Chinese whispers from the central policy-making bodies, DFT, maybe some of the bigger combined authorities, that trickles down into Jane Doe, who works in the small local council, who's never heard of any of these technologies, who doesn't have a team to help implement some of these plans. And so the culture down at the grassroots of that coalface mean that you don't get this adoption of a different way of thinking. And then industry mirrors public sector. So the way in which industry, maybe a consulting firm, sets up their departments and they have their ITS, their health, their transport, and then the local authority has their public transit, social care. The way that those two things structure become a chicken and egg again, that one serves the other, and a lot of the spend goes in that cycle as well. So I think what I'm excited about with the Transport Data Strategy action plan, and actually the Transport AI strategy coming out, because I think there's huge opportunity with this new wave of AI for making a lot of this data and analytics more accessible.
Indeed.
And by that, I mean, instead of your data scientist saying, was the intervention on this road useful before and after, that I can literally type in, was this intervention useful, and be served the charts, the text explanation, further questions to ask, that you start to make this data more accessible. That's when you can start to drive better decision makings that is more integrated. But it comes from being able to deeply understand the shape of the ecosystem and be very mindful about how, for example, mandating those key indicators at a local transport plan level will lead industry to changing its shape and therefore delivering those different outcomes. So perhaps answering the question, maybe opening many boxes, but
Indeed.
I think I'm very excited about the opportunities for the transport space and actually that more integrated way of thinking as well, as we look forward. And yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Anna.
Bloody hell, follow that. Don't know if there's much more we could do.
It is you, Graeme.
I know. Yeah, I think I'll take it a slightly different way, and again, from some experience I've had over the years. And it's a minefield. And from experience of working, largely, say, a lot of public sector organisations, typically they'll operate in silos, and they don't know, or they focus on their own area, but they don't know what else is there in other departments and how those can collaborate. One recent example from a client that will remain nameless, that 3 different parts of the same department were looking to procure almost identical data, but from 3 different providers. And they weren't joined up, and they didn't know who was doing what, and they were all being approached separately, and they're looking to procure it and spend big sums on these data sets, but without an overarching plan or strategy. And it's because there isn't an overarching organisation or there's a remit for it. This has always come back, probably about 13, 14 years ago now, when it was the Technology Strategy Board, and they were looking to have the competition to create the UK's future city demonstrator. And we worked with a few at the time, and one that was successful, and they put in a separate team at that time to coordinate everything and look at it right across the city council. And it was fantastic. But when the money ran out, the team was disbanded, and it was back to square one. Now, there was still some limited developments, but not to the real maximising the potential of what they had delivered over the previous 2 years, and have an organisation or have a team that just has that remit to try to bring together all the different data sets across one entity. And then that would have made, we know from the experience of on the short demonstrator period, some of the real positive outcomes that were achieved. So you kind of lose that, and it needs a bit more, a different thinking into the governance and the organisational and operational structure. And we see that not just necessarily in the transport side of the road side as well, where there's so many different data sets out there, and it's how do you bring them together? Now, AI undoubtedly will help that, because if we can get access to the data sets, but even on the day-to-day operational basis, we're not capturing them. We tend to think and operate in silos, and if we're really going to get the benefits from it, there's just that change in how we deliver things. One of the Actually, you'd mentioned Davin's talk earlier, and that was really impressive. Some of the figures he was quoting were really impressive. And I liked what said it's the thinking from National Highways, rather than from B to C, to recognise as a role B to B to C. I thought, that's good, that's the way it should be. But coming back to, from a consumer perspective or a user perspective, it's a single source of truth. So how do you have someone that's maybe the responsible body for all of the data that's being disseminated, so that it doesn't matter who you're getting the data from, but it's certainly for a network operations or network management, or if it's whether it can broader city management, you have that single source of truth. So everybody's working off this, what the desired objective will be. There might be slightly different ways of getting there, but it's that single source of truth element. And the other, kind of related to that as well, as I'd mentioned, I'd been involved in this area for a while, and I can't remember if it was the late 90s or early 2000s, but the European Commission put out a directive to try and facilitate whole private sector development of real-time traffic and traffic information. And part of the challenge, I think, is that people or consumers don't really understand the value of good quality information, particularly for travel and transport. And companies then have difficulty monetizing that. And that's going to continue to be a challenge. Might be an unpopular view, but if we start to look at things like the true costs of travel and transport, particularly road pricing, if you bring in road pricing, then you'll recognize the value of making choices. At the moment, people don't believe, or they don't really understand or recognize the cost of owning and using a car. And we still have a car-based transport system. If we move things towards a much broader approach, you pay for what you use, that might lead to delivery of more awareness of information and travel and what's more efficient. And again, that might lead to more understanding and awareness of data and what services can be available, so on and so on.
Thank you, Graeme.
And if anybody's against road pricing, they'll be lynched on the way out there, I expect.
Potentially we should double click on that in our next section. I have to ask, did you manage to change your client's view on why three separate departments were asking for the same data sets and procuring in three separate ways?
It's a work in progress, but yes, we are at the moment, because they haven't gone down some of the procurement, and they also didn't know that we already had some of the data available, because there wasn't the communication, there wasn't the collaboration internally. Sometimes it's as simple as just speaking to people and communicating. Going a bit of internal knowledge sharing, a bit more profile publicity. And again, we're all busy. We tend to operate in our own little bubbles. But just sharing some of that around, something simple. We have this data set available. This is what it can do. And then you'll come back and somebody else might contribute and say, I didn't know you had that. We've got something similar. How do you merge it? I've got a colleague that's been based in Copenhagen that's been working on this with Danish and Norwegian public sector authorities, and just going in and doing the data assessment around those authorities and making them aware of what do you have, and then developing some use cases to show them the potential of what, if you link some of these things together, you get better insight and better understanding. That allows you to refine and shape the services you deliver, almost certainly in a more effective and efficient way. So it comes back to outcomes and use cases every time.
Miranda, you have been waiting patiently.
I've done very well. I couldn't agree more. It is absolutely all about outcomes and use cases. And the answers data. Remind me what the question was. So it is quite often what the technology-driven discussion ends up with. And I think transport has struggled because can anyone tell me who the customer for integrated transport is? Who's actually spending the money? Who's actually buying it? And what are the intelligent questions that they're asking? I was delighted this morning to listen to Oliver Coppard, isn't he, from South Yorkshire, who said, tell me what the optimal price of a bus fare is. Because there's so much in that question. And there'll be really different answers depending on how you're accounting for greenhouse gases. What you're are you trying to achieve social mobility? Is it all about speed? Or are you trying to generate moments of joy? Sarah Sharples, when she talks tomorrow, will talk about her best journeys are the ones where she's on the right side of the train to see the cracking sunset. And Davin talked about it this morning in the way that route planning apps have the essence of the developer within them. I don't want to rely on somebody else to do that. If anybody's in the market for developing a route planning app, I want one that allows me to do a 30-minute cycle every morning. I don't care how I do the rest of it, but stop sending me on the bus. I want to do a 30-minute cycle. I want my exercise. And so those good questions and those sound customers, I think, is what one of the problems that transport has. When I look wider than that, and I look at sharing data, people share when they trust people. If you've ever had a toddler, ever played with a toddler, it's considerably easier to share your own toy, or other people's toys. Sharing your own toys is a bit more nuanced. There are people that have slightly sort of weird relationships with the data. I'm going to use grip. I like that because my data is extremely valuable, but also rubbish. So you can't possibly use it because if I expose it to you, you're going to see the frailties, and that's embarrassing. So I can hold those contradictory views in my head. I can laud Davin Crowley-Sweet for valuing his data, and at the same time berate Ordnance Survey for charging for theirs. Interesting. I worry that when we look at the open data spectrum, which is a fantastic tool, and the transport version is brilliant, I've used it already, we have too few tools to navigate it. The open license is global and forever. Brilliant if all you're releasing it to is wide-eyed academics and super marvelous innovators. Sadly, we also open it to hedge funds. I mean, not sadly. I mean, they do exactly what they say on the tin, right? And they will consume new data sources. So, for example, they've consumed data that's emergent from Tesla and completely rewritten the billboard advertising market. Because now people know where people with Teslas go. Suddenly, I'm paying a very different price for those corner lots. So we need to be smarter. We need to have better tools between giving it away to everybody forever and never giving it to anybody because it's too rubbish or too valuable or whichever end of the spectrum we use. And we need to have a better conversation about a fair exchange of value when we are sharing data. So if I'm sharing information about a flood model with a housing developer, I want to share that data. It's really important that housing developers have information about which houses are in the floodplain, because I don't want them to build houses in the floodplain. But if they then work on that model and put appropriate remediation in, and so that the houses that they're planning to build on what was the floodplain is no longer the floodplain, I want them to give me back that data about the remediation measures and about the properties. And that sounds like a fair exchange of value. That wasn't monetization. Monetization is a very pointy end of a spectrum of value. We need to think about when we are transacting with data, how we are helping each other and how we are building communities of trust.
Miranda, thank you. And that is a fantastic segue into the next section, where, don't worry, you're going to have a breath, because we're going to talk about, led again by you, Katherine, your perspective on behalf of DFT of the lack of alignment across industry, preventing execution and realisation of the strategy and the vision that you have all so cohesively talked about in the last half an hour or so. So, yeah, a little bit of your perspective, and if you can draw out where you see some of the greatest gaps, would be super.
So I think a lot of it's already been mentioned. I think, we work in a world of silos, both in terms of, departments, but even within departments, rail is on one floor, buses is on another floor. It's just ingrained to the way we work, and that is a challenge in the integrated world. But I think a lot of it ultimately comes down to people. Yes, freight, and I'm going to park the freight question, and apologies for anyone in the room who's here for freight, but for a lot of this about moving people, about how people want to move, your point about choice and it being genuine choice, not someone making that choice for you, is something we haven't necessarily grasped. And thinking about all the different data sets that come to bear to help with that choice. Some of it we are very good at. NAPTAN is a great example. We know where things are. We put out open, free data sets. Here everything is. Great. Well, that's one thing ticked. But what we're less good at is, why do those people want to travel? How do they necessarily want to travel? And so a lot of it is about actually, how do we come together and bring those different partners into that collaborative space? A lot of that data does exist, but it exists for very different reasons, for very different purposes. A round table at lunchtime with Sistra, we were talking about marketing kind of in the transport sector. And, you know, could we put surveys at the end of ticketing or the end of trips? Lots of people have pockets of information, but they don't necessarily know how to bring those people together or what they've got, and even omitting what they've got to share it. So I think a lot of it is about events like this. It's about the importance of getting the right people around the table and saying, well, here is the shared problem we want to solve. Who's got what? And as Miranda said, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone pile it into a data lake for free. It might be, well, what insights can you share? What data sets can you share? Can you pseudo-anonymize so you're protecting your IP? Can you use that data set to generate a synthetic data set that can then be shared and used? And starting to think about that creativity. But a lot of it is ultimately we're going to have to get people from a far more diverse group, and I use diverse in its broadest possible sense, round the table to start talking about, okay, what are the problems? How do we share them? Who's got what? And we need to look outside the transport sector to do that, because, you know, there are lots of data sets that are valuable. They might be in places we know about, energy, for example, but actually a lot of them are in private companies, innovators, SMEs who have developed some very interesting products, and we need to bring them around the table too. It's not just a case of those big players.
And why don't you think the SMEs are already around the table?
There's a lot of them. And actually, I don't think we necessarily know within the centre, or other operators necessarily know, who those SMEs are and what they do. And that is a knowledge gap. It can be a real challenge. And Anna, I'd be interested in your perspective about actually how we work together to solve those kind of challenges, to know who those SMEs are and how to bring them to the table and who to pair them up with.
Because this also talks to your point that you were making earlier around the structure, the ecosystem of the industry as a whole. So I'd be great for you to pick that
maybe
up
I could
and
dive
unpack
into. I think that there is this question of convening the ecosystem, and actually taking, Graeme, your point, but at like a broader scale, that culture of organizational design. But it's almost architecting the ecosystem of these transport players that we're interested in here. And one of the open questions that I had, we actually discussed this last week a little bit, is like, whose role is it to architect the ecosystem? Is it DFT's role? Is it industry groups' role? Is it someone like ITS UK or these conferences that we're at today? How do we expect this kind of cycle of, does it purely market driven? Do we expect stronger mandated leadership, dictatorship, whatever, or somewhere in between? And the question that I posed to you, Katherine, last week was, when we think about what good looks like, and a lot of this uncertainty comes from what is an optimal bus fare, or how are we defining that good? From DFD's perspective, is DFT's role to create the best possible transport ecosystem for the UK, the best possible, transport networks, let's say, so the most optimal running, the cheapest, the safest, the most efficient, the most productive, the happiest journeys, those moments of joy, it just be a wonder to travel, for freight to move, whatever. Or is it DFT's role to create a thriving transport economy where we're attracting investment into the country, where we are seeing high turnover in these industries, where we've got services, where we've got products, where actually there's deliberate friction in the way in which we operate to create that economy, to create those jobs? And I've often kind of stepped back, and I'm not an economist. I feel like someone who's spent time in that space might be able to answer this question for me better. But what do we want government's role to be in architecting that layout? And in the absence of having a firm and obvious answer, because I think it's a massive question, you then, if I scale it back to then the SME perspective, SMEs are often trying to come in with something disruptive and quite deliberate to try and find a niche or a way of thinking that can change how a system operates for a step change for the better. At Alkira, we're trying to do that through a lot of monitoring, evaluation, data, insight, analytics to try and surface that data discoverability and find an answer. But I can give an example of where we were building something that responded to one of the key terms in the BSIP funding around monitoring and evaluating bus networks in a certain way, that then shifted because it was felt that there wasn't an affordable enough solution on the market. We had just done a bad job of marketing ourselves. And so a product that we had invested time in creating suddenly became, no one needed it because it wasn't a requirement anymore. So SMEs are highly sensitive to that question of who's architecting the thing, who's defining good, because we are trying to find ways of navigating the emerging and changing space. And I think this question around how data silos, AI are kind of shifting the paradigm, I suppose a reflection, I know we're not supposed to do observations, but I'm on the panel, so I can observe. Yeah. I think a theme that's kind of been bubbling under the surface here is the complexity of the landscape we operate in has become so much greater in terms of the volumes of data that are out there, the scales of the organizations that are seeking to work. You've got 4,000 people in one company who are all trying to serve different groups in different ways, that actually surfacing who's working on what, understanding what data is available, what best practices out there, what case studies exist, how can we learn from what good already looks like. There's something really exciting about that to me because of the experiences I've had playing with some of the new AI coming out. There's something I wrote down, and feel free to turn this into a business if I don't beat you to it. But that concept of discoverability, it is, I don't know if anyone's played with some of these like AI tools. I don't know how much everyone uses them. I'm addicted to Claude. I use it daily, and every now and again I'll hop into Perplexity because Perplexity will give you sources of everything you're asking, which is fantastic. But it also will prompt you with questions, with kind of suggested questions that you may be interested in looking at. Now imagine a world in which you're starting to draft a report saying, I think we need to invest in buying this kind of data for this kind of use case. We need mobile network data to be able to plot the scheme for the Lower Thames Crossing Regeneration District in wherever. And on the side, it pops up saying, these 7 colleagues are working on this in the last week, and here are the reports that we've got within the organization that already cover stuff that you're already looking at. And some of that stuff, and this is what who else is doing. This is the data that you might already have. These are reports that have already been existed. Let me just quickly scrape the internet for you to see if anyone else has a similar use case across another public sector body. That is technically feasible to deliver today, no question. Like if you gave me 50 engineers in a month, I'd be able to pull something together that can answer some of that. But it all boils down to solid data foundations and deciding that that's the direction that we want to move in. So I definitely meandered through that answer there, but hopefully some interesting just nuggets of ways of thinking.
Very interesting, and we must get you access to Google Cloud's Gemini.
Sorry, I should have... Yeah.
No, it's absolutely fine.
I use Gemini on my phone.
There you go. Now we just need to adopt it into your organisation. Yeah. Who would like to pick up from Anna before we go to questions?
I'll crack on just a little bit, just a couple of reflections on what you said. When we go and consult to major organisations, we say data reflects the organisation. If it's siloed in your organisation, you're siloed thinking your data. But it doesn't in the transport mobility sector, and I call it the transport mobility sector. Data reflects the ecosystem. Our fragmentation of our data in our entire sector, it reflects the fact that we are fragmented from transport providers, fragmented from all over the place and that sort of stuff. So Miranda mentioned fair, and the fair exchange, but I'm going to turn that around and talk about the fair principles. Findable, there's your discovery, there's your discoverability. Accessible, it's got to be common standards. Interoperable, you've got to make sure, if we're going to be cross-sector, Graeme, we've got to make sure we're interoperable with other sectors and we don't define a road in one way and somebody else. And reusable, so that's that open license. If it's monetized, fine, and make that go through. The 3 barriers to execution are three Ps. It's the projects, or the tech, or the procurement even, should we say. It's the people. And it's the policy. Now we know that we've got a policy here and a roadmap to enable that policy, and hopefully that includes other data types across the spectrum. We've got people, and give us a few of us on this board and a few out there, we'll try and do that, architect the ecosystem between us.
Yep.
But let's try and make sure that we do the right projects and we get them all aligned with those data as well. So those 3 Ps are key for going forward for us.
Thank you, Hayden. Miranda or Graeme?
I'll just take questions.
Just
No, sorry. It's all. So I completely agree. It's all about the use case. The risk when we start talking about interoperability is that we start talking about metadata standards and ontologies and taxonomies. And brilliant, fill your boots. But unless you've aligned to a use case and a keen set of people who are interested in the outcome, the risk is it's a bunch of barely carbon-based life forms talking to each other. We've got to keep it carbon, not silicon, really. Yes.
Talking about barely carbon-based life forms, I'll say a few things. I think, again, everything, I agree with it, so I won't repeat it, but one of the issues that I've seen over the years is short-term thinking. And if you're going to create the ecosystems, you have to recognise it's not going to work in 6 months or a year. It might, but equally it's probably going to be longer term. And if people are investing, if you've got your 50 engineers developing things, you'll want to get the return on that over many years. You don't want to have to change it every couple of months or every year. So it needs the long-term thinking. You need continuity of policy. If it's change of governments or change of authorities, that's the big thing, is have something in place that can evolve, but it needs to be there. You need to have that continuity.
Thank you, panellists. Cool. Right. Who is going to be the bravest to start us off with questions for these quite brilliant minds? Are we doing mics or? Down the, down the front.
Thank you, Dr. J.
Of course, you knew that I would, but I might need a mic because my voice is not so good today.
It's just coming down.
I think it's coming.
It's going to be for you.
That'll get your exercise in.
This is Jane.
Oh, cheers. No worries. Hey, I'm Dr. J, use they as a pronoun. I'm the acting as a service owner for NAPTAN. So thank you for mentioning it, those who didn't know that I was sitting in the front. But one of the things, and this, I know you've kind of touched on it, but one of the things that's really impacting NAPTAN especially, which is the data set that underpins all of the public transport within the UK. I'm just mentioning it because some people might not know it, because nobody knows about it, is that breaking down of silos. It's one of the things that we're trying to do, and I know you've all said really nice things about how to break down silos, but what is the one thing that we can start doing to break down those silos? Because we've got to make actions now. We can't wait, because Brenda can't travel to see Beverly easily.
Can I? I'm going to hop in. I think what was just discussed around the importance of the use case is key. As a solution provider, I can format a solution in the shape in which the problem is presented to me. And until we start thinking about the use cases in an integrated fashion to justify why you need to have that integration in the first place and why you want to break the silos, then it doesn't make sense to try and break silos for silos' sake. So when I was talking earlier around how I feel like public sector industry mirrors public sector, when you have a local government with certain divisions choosing to operate in a certain way, and then you have a private body, again, who has departments that operate in a certain way, they do so because they're responding to the use cases and the use case phrasing and terminology that is used to get there in the first place. But if you change a problem to from being, how do we make this bus route run best, and instead describe it as, how can we make the journey of someone traveling through the center of town be best, then suddenly you have to bring experts who think about urban planning and design, who think about rail links, who think about health experience, where the nearest toilets are going to be if you need to have public toilets or services nearby. Until you frame the use case in a way which asks for input from those different silos, you're not going to break it down. So I think it's probably both sides of the coin's problem, the problem owner and the solution provider. It both needs to be how, as someone who owns a piece of infrastructure or owns an operating body, conceives of their problem. And it's how, in a solution design space, we take responsibility for trying to think of it in a way that drives that outcome best. And this was about who's defining what good looks like and what is that outcome. Like, let's just take that as read. But I think it's about the language and the phrasing of those use cases that would probably be the single biggest thing that would incept that change.
Can I do a word on defensive silos? So silos are very important for people to compartmentalise problems in a common way. And respecting the silos and respecting the reasons why data has been produced in a certain way for a certain use case. If we neglect that, we do so at our peril.
I'd say the transport data strategy says it actually from 2 years ago, actually said open by default, and you'll make every means possible you can to do it. Just people aren't doing it. There was a reference to the transport data strategy a couple of years ago, just talking about if people aren't doing it, then there'll be this crack team of data ninjas who will go out and help people to do it. That, unfortunately, with changes in government, hasn't happened as much as because it should be. So it's back to that. The policy's there. We just need to then get the policy enacted and get people working on it. Back to your use case.
Yeah, and I guess what we're saying is silos aren't always bad, but sometimes they're good. And we want to be balanced, I suppose. Yeah.
I think the only thing I'd add is just don't forget this is people. No one goes out their front door and gets straight onto a train or straight onto the stress RN. This is about people. And if you think about it in terms of people, all of that wider engagement, all of that softer stuff is what comes to bear.
Yeah.
Oh, next question.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. It's Leon Kong from Greater Anglia. I love all this direction in terms of data sharing and data standardization, but putting my kind of transport operator hat on, it feels like there is a type of data, I don't know if you can call it data, but I'm going to call it data, that I feel it is potentially missing from the conversation, and specifically I'm referring to when it comes to running an effective, efficient, kind of well-run transport operator, a lot of the operational decisions that are taken are tacit knowledge, kind of siloed away in Tim from Fleet Control's head from like 30 years of experience. Especially, you look at a day in the control room when there's disruption, it's all gut feel and instinct. And for me, it feels like a potentially missed opportunity if in trying to push for greater data standardization and subsequently sharing, we don't at least attempt to say in an integrated transport data strategy, we should capture these not yet data, but actually should be data in the spirit of operational improvement, in the spirit of replicability, etc. Just thought I'd get your thoughts on that. Apologies, this is probably a semi-question, not very question. Sorry, no observations, but...
I can pick that one up first. To me, from being involved in operations and network operations, data-driven decision-making is the key to it all. As you said, you've probably got someone there that's been involved in it from before they'd access to all of these data sets, and it's instinct, and they know that's what we did before, that's how the network runs, I know best. But if you've got the different data sets, you understand what data is available, and how do you apply that to an operational environment? You can have data-led decisions. And sometimes it's a bit of a shift and a change to get people on side because they don't trust the data at first because they know how it works. But once you get some examples and work with them, again, it comes back, it's a bit about people as well. Don't forget it, because that knowledge is valuable, because there's elements that the data might not pick up that they would have from the operational side and from experience and seeing how it works and seeing how people behave. But bringing that together and just iteration of processes that's been there, but use data to drive a lot of that and inform. That, to me, is what we've found has been a big shift in how we can be more efficient and more effective in management of networks.
Thank you, Graeme. Is your question also, how do you get out of the individual who's been doing this for 30 years, the relevant information? Yeah.
Because it's tacit knowledge, and that is arguably data in its own right.
Indeed.
And I'm only on this journey because I'm attempting to build AI decision-making tools. And part of that is you have to codify these decision heuristics into data points, and that's what sparked the thought of, is this a class of data that we're potentially not even talking about?
I mean, I can pull a specific example. So one of our products is called Alkira Bus. We need a new name, so bear with it. Alkira Bus, from Alkira. But as a tool to try and identify where you've got pinch points along junctions, links, and corridors in a region to see where you might want to be upgrading or prioritizing investment in that infrastructure. And we've had some hard sales of that because the bus guy in the local authority has said, no, I know where they all are. I know what's going on. Like, I don't need the data to tell me because I know it. I call up my bus drivers. They know what's going on. We all, we've got this thing sussed. And we were like, well, we'll do a little trial. We call it a spot check. We'll just go and take a snapshot, see what's going on, see what we highlight. You can see if you agree or not. And I think it was 70% of, 7 of the top 10 places they were aware of, but hadn't ranked in the correct order based on the severity of those things. So basically, the bus driver was pissed off because he's always stuck at one certain junction, but that junction was kind of irrelevant for the rest of the network, but it annoyed him as a bus driver. And that is a problem in itself to address. But 3 of them, 2 of which were the top of the list, they had no idea about. And so I think there's a role that data can play to help evidence, that kind of data-driven decision-making piece. But then beyond that, when you start to use digital systems, you create the record of change in that feedback loop. So when then putting an intervention in, seeing the feedback of whether it worked or not, and then coming back into the cycle, actually what we're trying to do here is not get rid of Tim, who's been there for 30 years, but observe Tim as he's trying to make the systems operate, and then train Jeremy and Jane, who are joining the organization as grads and bringing in that next wave of people who are trying to help build the next wave of transport infrastructure systems, who don't have the benefit of 30 years experience and are expecting to move in a different way because they've started their careers where micromobility is out there and where they've heard the name mass and they'd like to think that they could kind of have that multi-stage journey. The newer traveler is trying to think in a different way, and the newer operators coming in as well. So how do we get that skills transfer, and how can we make digital systems help support that? I hate to use the phrase co-pilot because I think it's been pulled in so many different dimensions and means too much at the moment. We'll give it 5 years and use it again. But the kind of how do you create a co-pilot for that professional as opposed to replace them and absorb their knowledge as you work with them to help the outcome that they're ultimately trying to drive?
Hello, I'm Adam, and I'm from a local authority. And just as an observation, I definitely feel like you've siloed us all together. But yeah, my question is, it's really in data. It's like there's so much data out there, and it completely drives everything what we do in terms of it. But from a local authority perspective, we can't always procure the data what we need. And I'll give you an example. I can go and get connected vehicle data and understand the 85th percentile speeds of all the roads in Stockport instantly. But I can't afford to do that because I wouldn't spend all my capital money on just gaining data. So I have to go and get ATCs, the tubes on the roads, because they're cheap and I can do it and look at very localized areas. How do you think, well, what would you say is the best way to kind of combat that in terms of being able to have the data what we need?
So I think some of it comes down to that collaboration point. You might not be able to afford it on your own, but can you afford it if you work with other areas? So I know across London in the GLA, lots of local authorities don't buy individual data sets. The GLA buys them as an umbrella group. So that's something that we're seeing as a successful model, is where local authorities are bounding together and sharing things. What a lot of it also comes down to is that commercial point that you touched on right at the beginning, is actually how do we get the right commercial frameworks in place? How do we get people upskilled to understand those commercial frameworks? How do they know that when there is a service being put in place or there are new sensors being put in, that you're writing those clauses to say, and that data goes back to X and Y? So it's not an easy problem to solve, but I don't think it necessarily always comes down to just the money.
I think there's definitely... A few years ago, I felt like there was a market forming for this, and it kind of, the bottom fell out of it, and a couple of businesses who were trying to resell connected vehicle data went out of business. And new businesses are now coming in to fill that space. But it's interesting to see how that market may form. we talked about how hedge funds are looking at some of this data as much as transport bodies, and the budgets for those two different groups are wildly different. And so it would be interesting to see whether those data providers acknowledge that there is a market from the local transport space where there should be a different pricing because it is public sector in a different way that makes that more accessible. But at least in the meantime, harvesting some of those open data sets and finding affordable ways of accessing that data, like it's a constant struggle. Because that market hasn't formed yet, that like kind of race to the bottom of the price points hasn't happened yet. And I do think that DFT could play a significant role in making that happen. I think when I mentioned before those the LTP key indicators, like if you create a reason for certain reporting to take place, and it makes sense that the only way to create that reporting is to have a certain type of data, that then you create the market that is going to demand it, which means you're going to drive the race to the bottom on the price point to provide it. And so I do think that there's an opportunity to kind of, as an industry, as an ecosystem, what is it? It's like a decentralized, I can't remember what the language is that someone was using earlier this morning, but as an ecosystem come together and understand where that balance of use case can be, where the price points need to go to make it happen, and how DFT can play a role in creating that part of the market, to mean that you can buy your TomTom, INRIX, OD, Matrix data, BT Active Intelligence. I should list all of the names of the ones that I know of right now, but how can you pull those all in and make them affordable for your specific use case of what you're trying to do? And there has been chatter of central government procuring some of these databases at a national scale, and that's a commercial decision that central government would have to make to understand what are the use cases. And from what I've understood from our conversation, it's a lot around getting those use cases clear from what it is that you need for why you want that data, to make sure that the right kinds of data are procured at the right frequency, availability, and whatever.
And the right kind of data is key, because your problem that you've articulated is about speed data and understanding speed. Connected vehicle data is one mechanism to get that, but it's not the only mechanism, and it's understanding what other mechanisms exist to answer your question, not necessarily defaulting to this is the data set I know, but what data do I actually need to answer that specific question?
Hayden.
Having worked on, working on the UK's rail data marketplace, I would say data has a value. But it has a value in different dimensions. The further up the data spectrum you go, the more to personal, it has a value. If you don't believe that, go on the dark web and look at credit card data and see how much value it's going for. If you actually come all the way down the open, it can be free, yes, but as long as it's properly free and open. But it also has a value on how recency it is. So real-time data, I'm working on a startup that does real-time satellite data, and that has a huge value. Data that's it almost goes in half-life, so like your nuclear sort of, it goes, the half-life just drops away how old it is. And it also, however granular it is, it has a value as well. So the more finely grained, the more detail it is about individuals or about individual things and events, the more value it has. So my peers up here are correct. It has a value. So talk about bulk buying or buying it with other organizations to buy it, or only buy what you need when you need it for whatever purpose, and try and get somebody to subdivide it and cut it up into chunks that you can use it. Okay, so it has a value in different dimensions.
For what it's worth, we now scrape BODS data to use as samples of what speeds might be looking like through certain corridors. There are weird ways of getting around open data that, depending on, I mean, we've sent one of our team, bless him, out on the streets with a yellow jacket and a clicker, counting and validating and just making sure that how we are treating this data becomes usable. But for certain use cases, as you say, the granularity, the recency can flex, and that means that you can be quite creative about what data you use to come up with that solution. I think because all of us on the stage have spent a lot of time thinking about and dabbling with this data, we probably see some links together that I think I always feel like we need to amplify those case studies more and make them more visible and accessible, so that that best practice can be carried to more areas, because I think that some of these problems are kind of solved just slightly, but I think there's a long way that I'm excited for us to be able to go next in how data gets shared.
Thank you. One more question? Jocasta. This is going to be interesting.
Oh, here we go.
So, Jocasta, Google Cloud. we're all data professionals and we all talk about data and we talk about use cases and taxonomies and ontologies. A lot of people who utilize our data don't understand data, and they don't understand what we're talking about when we say a use case. So how do we educate the people who are in need of this data and need to be able to use it to understand what we're talking about, so we get what we need out of it and they get what they need out of it?
So I think a lot of it is very simple in one regard. It's who, what, when, why, and how. So who are we trying to help? Where are we trying to help them? The when gets a little bit tricky. When might not be quite as relevant. And the how, which is coming onto that integrated point. So I think you don't necessarily have to be an expert in data or AI to understand that actually that a lot of what we're trying to do and a lot of what we're trying to enable is that who, what, when, why, and how question. And actually, if you break it down into those terms, I think it becomes more accessible, becomes easier to tell a story. And a lot of the time, that's what we're trying to do with information, is tell that story to help make those better decisions. Too much data can actually be a problem in that regard. So I think for me, it's that storytelling and that who, what, when, why, how type bit.
Thank you. Miranda.
What decisions are you trying to make? What information are you using to make those decisions currently? What information would you like to have that would enable you to make a better decision?
Well, panel, we have 1 minute left. Or maybe...
Ooh, 5 seconds.
4 seconds. Sorry. 63
Does it make
seconds.
a noise?
I think you will all join me in a huge thank you and commendation for a very, very rich discussion on the future, the opportunity, the barriers. But my goodness, with leaders like this in the room, I think the future is incredibly bright for the transport industry. Please will you join me in thanking, and a round of applause for each of our panelists.
To meet you.
Yeah, and you.